you, but then I look at my notes, and then I'm, moving away from the microphone. So, all right. So we're almost done with our study in Leviticus. We have today, and then we'll have in 2 weeks. We'll look at the Day of Atonement finally. So again, Leviticus, we're talking about why the sacrificial system, and there's a question after the covenant is made in Exodus chapters 20 through 24, is how can a holy God live with a sinful people? He wants to live in their midst, and how is it that can be possible? So we have all of these laws given to us about sacrifices, about sin, about the priest, about uncleanness and the Day of Atonement, which is all about answering that question. How can God live in the midst of a holy God live in the midst of a sinful people? So when we're talking about uncleannesses, the Bible uses these categories of holy and common. When we talk about holy or sanctified, that's something that's set apart for a specific use that's not allowed to be used for a common use. So I mentioned, we have utensils in the kitchen that are supposed to be only used in the kitchen. They're not supposed to go home with us and be used in our houses. Don't push the analogy too far, but those are set aside for those particular things where our common dishes are at home, and I can grab a spoon and use it for digging up dandelions as long as I don't tell my wife. But no, I wouldn't really do that. Don't tell my wife. And then pure and impure, or clean and unclean. So the words pure and clean, impure and unclean, those are the same words in the Bible. They're different in English because they have different roots, but they can be used absolutely interchangeably. So uncleanness is an impurity, but these are not, they're not physical in the sense of, oh, you got dirty, now you're unclean. It's not that kind of thing. Or you got sick, so you're unclean. But we're talking about the ritual system. If you're unclean, you can't participate in the rituals. You can't bring sacrifices to the tabernacle. You can't participate sometimes in just the life of the day-to-day life of the community, as we'll see today. So this all has to do with the ritual. Can someone who's considered unclean approach God? And the answer to that question is no, they can't. Uncleanness can be the result of an immoral act, but the ones that we're looking at are ritual. And so it's kind of a spiritual thing, not a physical thing. I mentioned that the greatest example of this in our modern time was around the vaccines for COVID. And wherever you are on the spectrum and how many ever you received, that's a little bit moot, but there were people who actually said things like, oh, you didn't get the COVID vaccine, therefore you cannot get treated in an emergency room. Okay? You don't deserve to be treated if you have an emergency and you have to go to the emergency room. It had nothing to do with their health. This had nothing to do with their physical state. It was, did you have it or did you not? And if you didn't have it, we're treating you differently. And you can't approach, as it were. And that's what we're talking about with ritual uncleanness. So when we're going to look at a physical disease today, again, we're not looking at it from a medical point of view, we're looking at it from a ritual point of view. Okay, so in Leviticus 11 through 15, we're given a number of unclean states that the food laws, we're given those. We looked at childbirth last time. We'll look at leprosy today. We're not going to get to the issues of Leviticus 15. And we're not going to look at death in Numbers 19. Obviously that's in Numbers and not Leviticus. But these impurities, they're ritual impurities, but they require a sin offering. So it's not sinful to give birth to a child, but the mother had to bring a sin offering to the tabernacle or the temple. And we looked at Luke chapter 2 when Mary does this after the birth of Jesus. So what we're asking is why did these require sin offerings? Because they aren't sinful acts. So what is the purpose? And with childbirth, we looked at it as it related to the curse in Genesis chapter 3. And we'll look at that a little bit today with leprosy. All right, so Leviticus 13 and 14. We're not going to read the whole thing today, and I forgot my reading glasses, so I don't know how much I'm going to read anyway. Leviticus, and they're long. Leviticus 13 and 14 are quite long. They deal with a disease that's generally translated leprosy in the Old Testament and throughout this passage. There are 3 case laws, and one has a lot of subdivisions, which we won't go through today. But there's a person can have leprosy, fabric can have leprosy, and houses can have leprosy. Okay, so those are the 3 case laws in these 2 chapters. And Leviticus 13 outlines all of the laws pertaining to a person who has leprosy. Then Leviticus 14 starts with the rituals for being clean. We'll look at some of those. And then it talks about the clothing in the houses as well. Now, when I say leprosy, what do you think of? What are some of the symptoms of leprosy as you would think of that term right away?
Skin disease.
Okay, skin disease.
Skin turning white or falling off.
Okay, skin turning white or falling off. We're going to come back to that.
You're separated from others.
Okay, yep, yes. You have to be separated from others.
And oozing sores on your arms and body.
Okay, oozing sores. Good. Okay, so Hansen's disease. Does anybody know what Hansen's disease is? Okay, so often when we think about leprosy, we think of things falling off. So a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, if they had, in the Bible, they'll say it about the Bible times, well, they had leprosy, which means that their hands and feet would fall off, or their nose would fall off, or their ears might fall off, things like that. This was not what we're talking about in the Bible. That kind of thing. Sorry, Paul. This diagnosis wasn't known in the Old Testament. It was known by the New Testament time, but it wasn't known by the Old Testament time. Leviticus 13 goes into great detail, well, some detail, I should say, not great detail, but some detail on the symptoms, and it never describes what's known as Hansen's disease. It also applies to clothes and houses, which Hansen's disease does not. And the focus, again, is not on the medical situation that the person has, but on the ritual situation. Ritually, they're not allowed, if they have this condition, to go to the tabernacle, or even, if it's severe enough, participate in daily life. So it's not focused on the medical. Now, what Paul said, though, about it being, what did you say before? White, yes. What Paul said about the word white is actually 100% correct. That's an A.
50%.
So you're shooting, yeah, you got 1 for 2. What appears to be the common description of leprosy in the Old Testament is white or white/flaky skin. Now, in Leviticus 13, some circumstances are oozy, to use Brian's word. But when we look at all the stories, like Miriam, God strikes Miriam with leprosy, and it says her complete body turned white. When we look at any of the Old Testament stories where someone has leprosy, the person, it's always noted as their skin turned white. So from the observer, their skin became white. And in the Hebrew, it has the idea of being white and flaky, like dead skin sloughing off, basically, is the idea. That's very pleasant after our cake that we just had. But but yeah, it's just, it's the white, you think of a white flaky skin that's sloughing off. That's kind of what we're talking about here in Leviticus. It can come on quickly, it can also go away quickly. That's the other thing about Hansen's disease. Once you got it, there was no known cure. You never got over it. But we wouldn't have Leviticus 13 and 14 unless you could get over the disease. So what I want to look at, so this is actually one of the most interesting things I found leprosy, this chapter 13 and 14, to be extremely interesting. And I found my dissertation, so I can actually reference it now. It was in storage, and John was holding on to it for me. But when we look at leprosy and what's going on with it, what I think we find is that it's symbolic of death itself. And I'm going to try to make the argument for that here, if I can just explain this one. Okay, so the first thing is, being that it's symbolic of death, I thought I had the right page here. I really thought I had the right page, but at least, hold on. I didn't have the right page marked, so we'll fast forward. Here we go. I think I found it. Okay, found it. I really need to remember my glasses too. Okay, so Leviticus 13, verses 45, starting in verse 45. Why do I consider it to be symbolic of death? The idea of leprosy. So in Leviticus 13, verse 45, Moses says, "The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.'" Okay, and then the next verse, "He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean, he shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp." Okay, so here's a bunch of things that are just stated. His clothes are to be torn. He's supposed to wear his hair down, and the idea is messy. Okay, it's not that they all had long hair that they wore up, but the idea is it wasn't supposed to be taken care of. They're supposed to cry out with their uncleanness and put their hand over their mouth, like this, when they cried out. And they were supposed to live alone. They couldn't live at their house, and in fact, they had to live outside the camp. So they couldn't be part of the community. Now they're still alive, but they are all, they have all of these things that they have to do.
Sounds like something contagious.
It sounds like something contagious, but they aren't, and there can be quarantine as well, but it never says that it would be a transmittable disease. We don't know that for sure. because all the lepers would be outside together, outside the camp. Now, once they move into Israel, they have to live by themselves. So you don't have leper colonies, although leper colonies developed later. Okay, until they are clean. Now, the acts of tearing one's clothes and letting one's hair hang loose is a sign of mourning over the death of a loved one. And this actually happens in Leviticus 10 when Nadab and Abihu died. So in Leviticus 10 and verse 6, Nadab and Abihu just died. Their bodies were just carried out. And Moses said to Aaron and Eleazar and Ithamar his sons, "Do not let the hair of your heads hang loose, and do not tear your clothes, lest you die." Okay, so why they weren't allowed to mourn. If you remember the story of Nadab and Abihu, Aaron wasn't allowed to mourn the death of his own children when they died because he had already been anointed as priest. And as the anointed priest, he could not come into contact or even be in the same location as someone who was dead. And we don't get to go into death in Numbers 19, but again, I'm showing that there's this association with death. To this day, it's a Jewish tradition that when somebody dies, you tear your clothes. And I hate to use a pop cultural reference, but in the movie The Jazz Singer, from a long time ago, this actually is a very important part of the movie. Because the son goes off and does his own thing, and his dad tears his clothes and his dad leaves. And saying to his son, "You're dead to me. I don't have a son anymore." He tears his clothes. But they still do this to this day. Jewish people still do this. When they're mourning the death of someone, they tear their clothes. So the person with leprosy has to tear their clothes. They have to let their hair go disheveled. So they don't wash it, they don't brush it. We see that as an example here. The covering of the upper lip actually happens in Ezekiel 24. Ezekiel 24, verse 15. Let's see if I can find that quickly here. As a sign of mourning. It says, "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man," so Ezekiel, the Lord speaking to Ezekiel, "Son of man, behold, I am about to take the delight of your eyes away from you at a stroke. Yet you shall not mourn or weep, nor shall your tears run down. Sigh, but not loud. Make no mourning for the dead. Bind on your turban, put your shoes on your feet, and do not cover your lips." Okay, so when the Lord is speaking to Ezekiel, he says something terrible is about to happen. I don't want you to mourn for the dead. And what does mourning look like? Okay, so what's the opposite of mourning? He's supposed to be dressed, and he's not supposed to sigh, he's not supposed to cry, he's not supposed to put his hands over his lips. So here this is associated, this movement is associated with mourning. So these are different ways that, or cry out. Cry out is also in this passage in Ezekiel. And then the final thing is, they have to live alone outside the camp. And the dead would be buried outside the camp. There's a ritual in Numbers 19 that takes place outside the camp, ritual for the dead. So they have to live alone. Now, the Old Testament often uses this phrase, cut off. If you do something evil, you will be cut off from your people, from your inheritance. And that phrase cut off in some contexts is clearly capital punishment. Okay, you're killed. In some cases, it's a little ambiguous, and it seems to mean that you're put out of the land or outside of the camp. In other words, you're no longer considered one of the people of God, so you're dismissed. This is where our doctrine of church discipline comes from. You are put outside the family in judgment. And so this idea of being outside the camp and living alone also has with it the idea of someone who is dead. So you're alive, you have leprosy, your skin is white and flaky somehow so that the priest comes, he looks at it, he might do some tests, he might do some other things, but once you're declared unclean with leprosy, you have to do all of these things, and it's as if you are acting out death itself. And then there is also, which I don't have on the slide, the fact that it's this white flaky skin, which I said is kind of, the sloughing off that we're kind of used to, symbolizes death itself. It's our body returning to dust. I used to work in a large building, and we had printers, but we had a lot of people, and we had a lot of cubicles. So we would go around and dust the top of the cubicles rather regularly. Okay, so 95% of all dust composed of what? Dead skin, right? The rest of it, almost all the rest of it is paper fiber. And then there's a percentage of, now we know all these microplastics and everything else that are in the air. But the vast majority of it is dead skin cells. Okay, so leprosy fits right in with that.
Do we have leprosy today? Is that a medical diagnosis?
Well, we don't have, this would have all kinds of other dermatological diagnoses now from a medical perspective. And then we have Hansen's disease now that we call leprosy. But most of these would fall under some other, dermatological disease.
So it's not like a fatal kind of condition.
No, it's not fatal, which is another reason Hansen's disease is fatal. But this is something you can recover from. But until you do, you're a dead man walking, as they say.
There's no cause.
Right, there's no cause.
So it could happen to anybody.
Yep, we've got the illustrations of where it happens to kings. We have the illustrations where it happens to, Miriam was divine, but Moses, on command, it was one of his signs. He put his hand in his cloak, brought it out, it was leprous. Put it back in, brought it out, and it was clean, or cured. All right, so not only is it symbolic of death, I think leprosy is also symbolic of resurrection. And there are so many places in the Old Testament that talk about resurrection. Daniel chapter 12, it's explicit. But even Psalm 1, I think, is talking about resurrection. When it talks about standing in the congregation, it means resurrection. In other words, in order to stand in the congregation, when all of Israel is reunited under the Messiah, if you're standing in the congregation, it means you've been resurrected. But there are so many people who don't believe that the resurrection was taught in the Old Testament. And my daughter said that there was a professor at SMSU that she had that would say that, and she would be like, that's not correct, A, B, C, D. And then he would say it in another class, and she's like, do you want me to correct you again? That's, the Old Testament teaches the resurrection. It's clearly in the New Testament. Oh, Lazarus is dead. And Jesus says, he's going to raise again from the dead. And Mary says, well, we know that, but why didn't you come and cure him? And Jesus goes, no. You missed the point. This is the point. I am the resurrection and the life. Well, I am the truth and the life, in this case. So anyway, that everybody knew there was a resurrection. But I think the idea of leprosy actually gives us this, if The disease is a picture of death. The cleansing of the person, to me, is symbolic of the resurrection. So here in Leviticus 14, and here we'll look at some of the ritual for cleanliness. Starting in verse 1, Moses says, the Lord says to Moses, "This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest." Okay, so and you see this, this happens in a couple stories in the New Testament where Jesus heals lepers. And what does he tell them to do? Go show yourself to the priest. Okay, so Jesus is having them follow this law. He shall be brought to the priest. The priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. So he's going to just do a visual check. And if the case of the leprous disease is healed, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over, now my ESV says, fresh water. Okay. Over fresh water. Well, actually, to translate it literally, it's living water, or what we would call spring water. Okay, so have you ever gone to a spring, a real spring where the water is just springing up out of the ground all by itself, no pumps or anything? Okay, so it's fresh, it's clear, it's cold, but it's alive, right? It's moving of its own accord. So we use this word, living water. Does that sound familiar at all? Jesus and the Samaritan woman asking her for water from the well. Drink of my water that I could give to you, and you live, you will never die. So I don't think it's an accident that it has to be spring water, or literally living water, that's used in the sacrificial ritual. Okay, so let's see, we take the bird, we sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed, and he shall pronounce him clean. The priest announces cleanliness. Lets the living bird go, and he who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes. Now notice what he does. He washes his clothes, and then he shaves off all of his hair, and he bathes himself in water. Okay, so we go from torn clothes and disheveled hair to now, I would say, probably repaired clothes, clean clothes, and shaved head, and clean body. Okay, so you see how things are working in reverse. He shall bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean, and after that he may come into the camp, but live outside his tent. Okay, so he's allowed now to come into the camp, but he can't go into his house. So he's sleeping in a cot outside of his house, outside of his tent. For 7 days, so a week goes by. After that week, he has to cut off his hair again, his beard, his eyebrows, and all of his hair. Then he shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in the water, and shall be clean. So now he's super clean, and he can go into his house. Okay, so he can return to the camp. Then after a week, he goes through another cleansing ritual. Now he can go into his house. And then, verse 10, on the 8th day he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish. And it's a burnt offering, a grain offering, a sin offering, a wave offering. There's like 4 or 5 offerings he has to bring. He brings a whole bunch of offerings. The priest does a whole bunch of things. Verse 19, the priest shall offer the sin offering to make atonement for him who is to be cleansed from his uncleanness. And afterwards he shall kill the burnt offering, and the priest shall make the burnt offering and the grain offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him, and he shall be clean. So now he is able to participate in worship again. But you'll notice, again, it's a sin offering. So you have a case of the skin disease, you have this leprosy, you have to act as if you were dead. And all intents and purposes, you are. You're outside the camp. You can't fellowship with your family. You are, in a way, dead to them. You are gone. Now, little by little, you come back, and you come back, and you come back. And so, to me, this is a picture of resurrection. Through the living water and through the sin offering, you are back in fellowship with God once again. So I just find this very fascinating that God has built this into this ritual. Now, the last piece, because we're about out of time, why the sin offering? Well, so Genesis 3, we go back to Genesis 3, and we see that part of the curse in Genesis 3 says to Adam, you're going to work really hard because you listen to your wife, thorns and thistles. And he says in verse 19, I think that's verse 19, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So in Genesis 1, God takes the dust or the dirt of the ground and he forms man out of it. And he breathes into him the breath of God, and he breathes into him life. Well, now, because of sin, and because of Adam's sin, Romans 5, we all die. When we all die, we return to dust. We return to the dust of the ground. And so this idea of the dust or the flakes, again, the white flakiness or the sloughing of dust or dust in the room, this is what we are going to return to. And Ecclesiastes 3 is an interesting little passage where Solomon says, down in verse 16.
Only for
I think it's verse 16. Verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. Okay, so of course this is Solomon. We're nothing more than humans are nothing more than animals. For what happens to the children of man, what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place, which is just the grave. That's what he's talking about there. All go to one place,